This in itself is reasonable, and it is here that the issue of falsification could be raised, although this veers away from Feyerabend's intentions. I would argue that it is the theories which lie at the base of dependent hypotheses that require special testing and efforts at falsification, given the importance they assume within the hierarchy. I would go further and add that a tree of explicit assumptions should be made, corresponding to the underlying theory, branching sub-theories, and dependent hypotheses, such that this path can be easily visualized in connection with a particular study. Since later assumptions are contingent on earlier assumptions, regardless of whether they are part of theories, sub-theories, or hypotheses, these assumptions can be given a weighted value according to their position in the hierarchy, and by this reasoning it is the earliest assumptions which should be most challenged. Note that in choosing the assumptions to challenge, it is an error to think that the underlying theories are robust and have stood the test of time, because they might not have been as rigorously tested as later dependent hypotheses. One has only to look at drug trials to see the dramatic differences in drug trials in contemporary times compared to the earliest research showing the efficacy of lithium or penicillin, for example. Instead, Feyerabend argues that there is a tendency to consider hypotheses which are consistent with the main theory, and not those that are inconsistent with this theory. This is the essence of what he refers to as the consistency condition. Further, he states that the emphasis is on the identification of facts which can challenge the main theory. The essence of his argument is that resources are directed to what I will refer to as a winner-takes-all theory. A winner-takes-all theory is one that is focused on to the exclusion of all the other theories. His argument focuses on the need for variety in the theories that are examined, and it is here that the reasoning can be seen behind his assertion that hypotheses should be sought which are incompatible with well-established theories. However, if we take his arguments to their logical conclusion, then it should be asserted that all possible theories should be generated along with their corresponding hypotheses for due consideration. The obvious rejoinder to this is that if there are an extremely large number of possible theories, then there may be insufficient resources to be allocated to each. This leads to the principle of prioritization of resources for competing theories unless sufficient resources are available for each. This in turn leads me to the following conclusion. Feyerabend has been using a dichotomous framework in his approach to this topic and makes no mention of the resource issues that are important in the real-world scenario. The alternative and perhaps more realistic viewpoint is that it should be considered in a probabilistic manner and with due consideration for resources. Thus, if there are a finite number of resources R and a finite number of competing theories T1, T2, etc., and each has a corresponding probability of being correct, P T1, P T2, then it follows that resources could be allocated according to the formula Rx equals R dot P T of x, where x ranges from 1 to n, and n is the number of theories. This rests on the assumption that a. resources can be clearly delineated and expressed quantitatively. This should be possible through task analysis, and it should be recognized that in a number of cases, numerical markers may afford approximations. B. That there is a consensus on the probability of each theory being correct. Again, due consideration can be given to the method of choice. There is also the caveat that a certain proportion of the resources should be invested in the generation of new theories, which would mean a small correction to the above formula. Additional modifications could be made to the resource allocation according to the practical impact of the theory, and this itself can be further refined. He summarizes some of the views of John Stuart Mill on the process by which scientific theories become popular with time. In the course of his discussion on this, I was somewhat surprised to read the following statement by Feyerabend.
An empirical theory such as quantum mechanics or a pseudo-empirical practice such as modern scientific medicine with its materialistic background can of course point to numerous achievements, but any view and any practice that has been around for some time has achievements.
It is unfortunate that Feyerabend has not qualified this statement, but has merely referred to a rather vague quote, pseudo-empirical practice, unquote, and applies this term to, quote, modern scientific medicine, unquote. Given the potential ramifications of such a statement, I would expect a rigorous treatment of his supporting arguments, but instead there are none. As this throwaway statement appears in a book about the philosophy of science, I will suggest that this statement is out of keeping with many other aspects of the book, and the lack of supporting reasoning or evidence suggests that this is pseudo-philosophy. To be more explicit, by pseudo-philosophy I am referring to a statement or collection of associated statements which masquerade as philosophy but which lack supporting evidence or reasoning, or where it is present it does not stand up to close scrutiny of even the most basic kind. To take this further, I would argue on the basis of the current example that pseudo-philosophy allows prejudices to be mistaken for philosophy. In this chapter, Feyerabend starts by stating that all ideas are capable of furthering our knowledge, quote, however ancient or absurd, unquote. He advocates a pluralistic methodology which involves all theories. He is thus taking a step back from the consideration of the facts and hypotheses and looking at the bigger picture, the underlying theory.
Now this politically enforced dualism has led to most interesting and puzzling discoveries both in China and in the West, and to the realization that there are effects and means of diagnosis which modern medicine cannot repeat and for which it has no explanation.
He also gives the example of a herb which is analysed for pharmacological activity, upon which the active ingredient is removed. He argues that it is possible that the herb in its entirety is responsible for the herb's actions, rather than the individual agent. This hypothesis seems reasonable but would need to be supported by the empirical evidence. He also argues that
does this not mean that they must learn one particular set of views to the exclusion of everything else? And if a trace of their imagination is still to remain, will it not find its proper application in the arts or in a thin domain of dreams that has but little to do with the world we live in?
Again, this needs to be supported by the evidence. There are many instances of the imagination and other aspects of creativity being used to good effect in science. Quote, according to Hume's theories, cannot be derived from facts. This is a very brief statement and is not further explained. I presume it refers to the induction problem, in which Hume suggests that predictions cannot be made on the basis of past experience. Nevertheless, this statement appears to be incorrect. Newton, in deriving the law of gravitation, utilised Kepler's laws of motion, which in turn were derived from an observation of the motion of the planets in the solar system. Furthermore, Darwin accumulated a vast amount of evidence from different species before proposing his theory of evolution. Surely then a theory can be derived from the facts, and furthermore there are a number of ways in which this can take place, including pattern recognition and induction, iterative hypothesis testing, and unstructured methods. These theories are more robust when it is large numbers of data points that are being considered rather than individual data points. He then further argues that a theory is not consistent with all of the facts, and therefore theories should not have to be accepted on the basis of them being, quote, consistent with the available and accepted facts, unquote. I would argue that this is an oversimplification of the case. Theories are evidently not an all-or-nothing phenomenon, but instead exist on the balance of probability, explaining a proportion of the available facts. Therefore, I would argue that Feyerabend has not sufficiently presented his case for this rule to be dropped. There is still a case for theories being selected which fit with the facts, although it seems reasonable to select also those theories which do not fit with the facts. However, such theories should have some basis in facts, no matter how few the facts they fit with, as otherwise there would be no reason for them to bear any relation to reality, which ultimately is the purpose of a theory. Feyerabend then goes on to challenge the quality of evidence, for instance referring to the sensory apparatus thus.